Ladies and gentlemen, it started subtly. The missed calls that didn't get returned, the "I've just been busy" texts that came hours or days later without apology, the way he never quite made plans ahead of time, always leaving things open-ended like you were something he could slot in if nothing better came along. At first, you made excuses for it. You told yourself he had a lot going on, that people move at different paces, that maybe he just wasn't used to someone like you showing up with such sincerity. But deep down, something didn't feel right. And the part that hurt wasn't just his absence, it was your presence in the silence. You were always available, emotionally, mentally, physically. When he texted, you responded. When he hinted at seeing you, you rearranged your schedule. When he was having a bad day, you were his therapist, his cheerleader. You showed up and he showed up when it was easy. And yet you held on. Why? Because hope can be blinding. When we want someone to care, we look for the smallest signs and inflate them into meaning. A single night of deep conversation becomes proof of emotional connection. A compliment after days of indifference feels like a breakthrough. You fed off the crumbs, convincing yourself it was a feast. But if you were honest, it was clear you were always chasing a version of him that didn't really exist. Or at least not for you. You kept trying to rationalize the imbalance. You thought maybe if you gave more, loved harder, stayed a little longer, he'd finally see your worth. You wore your heart like a badge, thinking if he could just understand how real you were, he'd finally meet you at your level. But the truth is, someone who's not ready to prioritize you will never be moved by your benching. Not because you aren't enough, but because they're not in a place to appreciate what enough even looks like. See, there's a difference between being wanted and being chosen. You were wanted when it was convenient, when he was lonely, when he needed validation. But being chosen means being considered. It means you're not an afterthought. It means he sees your presence as something to protect, not something to lean on when life gets quiet. You saw the signs, every unanswered message, every last-minute plan, every time you walked away feeling more confused than cherished. And still you told yourself maybe next time it'll be different. But it wasn't. Because you weren't dealing with someone incapable of texting back, you were dealing with someone who didn't want to. You weren't dealing with someone too busy to see you, you were dealing with someone who didn't care enough to make the time. And that hurts. That realization is a punch in the gut because it forces you to confront the truth that love or even deep attraction isn't enough if you're not being prioritized. You can be incredible, giving, supportive, loyal to a fault, and still not be his priority. Not because you lack value, but because he's not capable or willing to recognize it. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking it was your fault. That maybe you were too available too. Emotional, too much. But the only thing you were too much of was present. And presence scares people who are looking for distraction, not connection. It intimidates the emotionally unavailable. It exposes those who aren't ready for the kind of love that demands effort, consistency, and vulnerability. So you were kept in the background not because that's where you belonged, but because he couldn't step into the foreground with you. And instead of rising to meet you, he let you stay on the shelf, conveniently reachable, but never truly chosen. It began with subtle compromises, not the kind that come with healthy relationships where two people meet in the middle, but the kind where one person slowly disappears trying to become what the other might want. You started shrinking, softening your edges, toning down parts of foundation of something real. You thought, if I can just be better, if I can just be more patient, more supportive, more understanding, he'll finally step up. But every time you gave more, he gave less. Not because he didn't have the capacity, but because he didn't feel the need. You were doing all the emotional labor while he sat back, reaping the benefits of your hope. What you didn't realize then was that you stopped assessing his value the moment you became obsessed with proving your own. You didn't ask the right questions. Is he showing up for me? Is he emotionally available? Does he reciprocate? Does he make me feel safe, seen, and prioritized? Instead, you were stuck in the loop of asking yourself, am I good enough? Am I lovable enough? What else can I do to make this work? You weren't chasing a man, you were chasing validation. And in doing so, you gave him a power he hadn't earned. You handed over the authority to define your worth by how he responded or didn't. And that's the tragedy, that someone so uncertain, so inconsistent, had the power to make you doubt yourself. He didn't need to be impressive. He didn't have to do the work. He just had to stand still while you did laps around him, trying to be everything you thought he needed. But here's the truth you missed in that moment. Proving yourself to someone who doesn't value you isn't noble, it's self-betrayal. It's a subtle way of saying, your standards matter more than my boundaries. Your affection is more important than my peace. And it's heartbreaking because you thought this was love. You thought loyalty meant staying through the confusion, the coldness, the emotional breadcrumbing. But all you were really doing was holding on to a version of him that only existed in your imagination. You gave without hesitation, without making him prove anything, without asking for much in return. You showed up with your heart in your hands, offering it to someone who never asked how heavy it was to carry. You were the safe space, the soft landing, the emotional cushion he could always rely on, not because he earned that kind of access, but because you gave it freely. And while that speaks volumes about your capacity to love, it also reveals the quiet way you betrayed yourself to keep him comfortable. He didn't mean to take you for granted, not at first. Most people don't, but when you offer something over and over without boundaries, without self-respect setting the pace, it becomes background noise. He stopped seeing your consistency as a gift and started seeing it as a guarantee. The calls you answered no matter the hour, the plans you always adjusted the way. You stayed available even when he disappeared. All of it told him, without words, that you'd always be there. No matter how little he gave, you'd find a way to give more. You thought your loyalty would eventually speak louder than his indifference. That one day he'd wake up and realize what a rare kind of love he had in front of him. But people don't appreciate what they don't have to work for. When something or someone is always within reach, always forgiving, always understanding, the mind doesn't register it as extraordinary. It registers it as standard, and he never had to earn your energy because you were handing it out like it was limitless. And the more you gave, the more he expected, not because he was cruel, but because you made it so damn easy. You created a dynamic where his bare minimum was more than enough. Because you kept filling in the emotional gaps with your effort. You were doing the heavy lifting for both of you, holding together something that looked like a relationship, but felt more like a one-person performance. And somewhere in that imbalance, he got used to the idea that he didn't really need to try. He didn't worry about losing you not because you weren't valuable, but because you made yourself so accessible, so accommodating, that the idea of your absence never felt real. You never set the kind of boundaries that made him pause and ask, am I doing enough for her? You never created moments where he had to step up to meet your needs. You were too busy minimizing them. You told yourself you were being patient, understanding, strong, but really you were teaching him that your love required no investment, no effort, no risk on his part. And in doing that, you slowly erased your own worth in his eyes, not because you weren't worthy, but because he never had to witness your standards. He never got to see what it would look like if you actually required him to match your energy. He never had to wonder if you'd walk away because you showed him time and time again that you wouldn't, even when he let you down. Even when he prioritized everything else, even when you felt empty from giving so much and receiving so little. You may have thought you were being the bigger person, that love is about giving without keeping score. And in some ways that's true, but healthy love involves mutual effort, mutual respect, mutual fear of losing each other. And he never had that fear because you removed the consequences. Every time you forgave without change, every time you stayed after another disappointment, you communicated that he could take you for granted and there'd be no real cost. What you thought was strength, he interpreted as passivity. What you offered as devotion, he received as convenience. And instead of stepping up, he stepped back, not because he didn't see your value, but because you never made him feel what it was like to be without it. You gave him the comfort of your presence while silently carrying the burden of your unmet needs. You kept making it easy, hoping one day he'd decide to make it worth it. But ease without accountability doesn't create gratitude. It breeds entitlement. It's a hard truth to face that all the words, all the pleading, all the heartfelt messages trying to explain your pain didn't move him. That the nights you sat there, voice shaking, trying to make him see the damage he was doing, only left you more exhausted. That your vulnerability, offered again and again like an olive branch, was met not with change, but with defensiveness or silence. You thought if he could just hear you, really hear what this was doing to you, he'd finally understand. But what you didn't realize at the time was that someone who's emotionally unavailable doesn't suddenly become available just because you explain your sadness more clearly. You begged in different ways, sometimes with words, sometimes with your silence, sometimes by staying longer than you should, hoping your presence would remind him of what he had. You tried being softer, quieter, less demanding. Then you tried being louder, more direct, more honest. But no matter what shape you twisted yourself into, he stayed the same, detached, unmoved, aloof. And with every attempt to pull him closer, he drifted just a bit further out of reach. Because here's what begging does: it confirms to the other person that you're still there. That no matter how they treat you, no matter how little they give, you will still fight for them. And while that might feel romantic when you're the one doing the fighting, to them it looks like they have time. It looks like they can afford to continue as they are because you haven't really left. You're still hoping, still invested, still available. And the harsh reality is some people don't wake up until the energy they took for granted is gone. That's what changed everything, not the pleas, not the apologies you were willing to accept, not the potential you kept clinging to, but the moment you finally stopped, not out of spite, but out of depletion. There came a moment when you realized that the version of him you were fighting for didn't actually exist, that the connection you kept reaching toward wasn't mutual, wasn't healthy, and wasn't growing. And in that moment, something inside you broke, but in the best way. Because it wasn't just your heart breaking from hurt, it was the illusion breaking. The hope that he might change cracked open and exposed the truth: he was never going to be the person you were building your life around. Letting go didn't mean you stopped caring. It didn't mean the feelings disappeared overnight. But it meant you finally reclaimed your energy. You stopped texting first. You stopped checking your phone. You stopped making excuses for why he was the way he was. And that silence, that lack of effort on your part, was louder than any speech you could have given. That silence created a void, one he had never felt before, because you were always there to fill it. And it was in that absence that the shift began, because people don't reflect when you're still standing in front of them, trying to teach them your value. They reflect when the lessons stop, when the access is cut off, when the emotional supply they've relied on without gratitude is suddenly gone. That's when the regret starts creeping in, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because they realize you stopped trying. And that silence, that space becomes deafening. That's when they see everything they ignored. Everything they dismissed, everything you gave now out of reach, but you weren't doing it for that outcome. You let go because you were finally done breaking your own heart to protect his comfort. You were done explaining what was already obvious. You were done performing worthiness for someone who should have seen it from the beginning. You didn't walk away to make a statement. You walked away because staying was draining. Something sacred in you, and you finally understood that self-respect speaks louder than desperation ever could. You remember the moment, even if it didn't feel like a grand event. There wasn't some cinematic turning point with tears and dramatic exits. It was quieter than that, more internal. A moment of stillness where something inside you finally gave up, not on love, not on yourself, but on the idea that he was going to change. You stopped begging, not because you ran out of things to say, but because you ran out of hope that he was even listening. That kind of shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds over time in all the little disappointments that accumulate when someone keeps showing you that your feelings don't affect them. For a long time, you believed that effort could fix everything, that if you just found the right words, if you opened your heart wide enough, if you gave him every last bit of your heart energy, he would wake up to what he had. So you stayed, you explained, you forgave, you hoped. You hung on to those rare, fleeting moments when he gave you just enough to keep believing. And in the quiet spaces between those crumbs of affection, you told yourself it was going to be worth it. That love takes work, that maybe he was just scared, confused, unsure of how to show up. You gave him every excuse under the sun because it was easier to believe he was struggling than to admit he simply wasn't choosing you. Begging doesn't always look like getting down on your knees. Sometimes it looks like texting first again and again, even after he's gone cold. Sometimes it's initiating the hard conversations while he dodges them. Sometimes it's forgiving what you never even received a real apology for. It's holding out your heart, raw and exposed, and praying that just this time, he'll hold it with care. But the more you tried, the more he pulled away, and the more invisible you became in a space you kept pouring yourself into. Eventually, it wasn't that you stopped loving him. It was that you stopped abandoning yourself. You started noticing how tired you were. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes from constantly fighting for something one-sided. You realized that no amount of proving yourself was going to make him ready, that no matter how loud your love was, it couldn't penetrate someone who wasn't open to hearing it. And that's when something in you shifted, not angrily, not dramatically, just silently. You pulled back not as a strategy to make him chase you, but as a form of self-rescue. The moment you let go, things changed not because he suddenly became someone different, but because you did. You stopped showing up for conversations where your voice didn't matter. You stopped accepting bare minimum behavior with maximum hope. You stopped rehearsing what you were going to say to fix things and started listening to the version of you that was exhausted from trying. And that's when the dynamic changed, not on the surface, but deep beneath it. Letting go wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't about making him miss you. It was about reclaiming your own dignity, about realizing that you don't have to convince someone to value you. The shift didn't happen because you found a new way to communicate your pain. It happened because you removed yourself from the position of trying to convince someone who had already shown you their decision. And the irony is, that's when he started to notice. That's when the silence felt louder than your words ever did. That's when the comfort he'd taken for granted started to feel like absence. Because people don't always register what they had when it's being handed to them daily. They feel it when it's no longer available, when the energy disappears, when the loyalty, the support, the emotional availability all vanish without announcement. Not out of punishment, but out of clarity, because the begging never made him think. The silence did. He didn't see it when you were there, or maybe he saw just enough to keep you close, to hold on to the comfort of you without having to fully step into what you needed. Either way, the result was the same. He didn't show up for you in the way you deserved. He played it cool, detached. Unaffected. Like you were just another option. Someone good, sure, but not someone he believed he could lose. He assumed your love was permanent. He mistook your patience for permission. And when you finally stopped showing up, when the effort became one-sided and the silence became permanent, something clicked for him that all your words never could. Now he regrets it. Now he sees it in flashes, moments where your absence stings in places your presence used to comfort. The late night quiet doesn't feel peaceful anymore, it feels hollow. His phone is full of conversations that don't feel like connection. He meets people who mimic parts of you, but none who carry your depth. He notices the way others talk but don't really listen. The way they take without truly appreciating. And suddenly he realizes that you were never the problem, you were the exception. To him, after you stopped handing it over without question, he had to feel the absence to understand the presence. That's not romance, that's reality. And yet, just because he finally gets it doesn't mean you're supposed to step back into the picture. His regret is a result of his actions, his choices, his inability to appreciate what he had when it mattered. Let him carry that. Let him sit with it. Don't clean up the emotional mess he made now that he realizes it wasn't just a phase or bad timing or miscommunication. It was him. And he has to live with the weight of knowing that. Your job isn't to guide him through his regret. You don't have to be the bigger person by letting him back in just because he finally feels what you felt. Growth doesn't mean reopening doors you closed for your peace. Compassion doesn't mean offering yourself up as a second chance. You can wish him well without inviting him back. You can acknowledge his regret without letting it dictate your future. Because while his apology may be sincere, it doesn't erase the damage done. And your healing didn't come from him finally feeling sorry. It came from the moment you stopped waiting for him to. He regrets you now, but that regret belongs to him. It's his mirror to look into, his timeline to sit with. You walked through the fire of being overlooked, dismissed, taken for granted, and you came out on the other side not because he changed, but because you did. You stopped needing him to validate your worth. You stopped bending to be enough for someone who never rose to meet you. His regret is loud now, but it arrived late. And you're not the same person who waited for it. For the longest time, you thought your strength lived in your ability to hold on. You thought real love meant persistence, meant proving yourself through your effort, your patience, your ability to weather the storm. So you chased, not in the obvious way, not by begging or pleading every day, but in the quiet ways, staying longer than you should have, rationalizing his behavior, overthinking every word he said, hoping that if you could just get it right, just be enough, he could. You thought if you loved harder, he'd step up. If you showed him how loyal you were, how much you believed in the connection, he'd finally match your energy. You convinced yourself that chasing was noble, that it was romantic, that it was just what people do when they care deeply. But the truth is, chasing wasn't strength, it was survival. It was fear disguised as love. Because deep down, you were scared that if you didn't chase, if you let go, he'd disappear, and what would that say about everything you poured into it?